5 men, 1 car, and a late night drive into the Sierra Nevada mountains that none of them were prepared for and had no reason to be. What happened that night remains one of the strangest, most unsettling mysteries in California history. The case so eerie, it's often called America's Dyatlov Pass. It's midnight somewhere, and tonight I have a story for you. On February 24th, 1978, a Friday night in Chico, California, 5 friends known to their families as the Boys made plans to attend a college basketball game. They were Jack Madruga, Ted Weiher, Gary Mathias, Jack Hewitt, and Bill Sterling. The boys were aged between 24 and 32 years old. Each had mild intellectual disabilities or psychiatric conditions, but all were high functioning and deeply loved their families, and they were extremely routine driven. They lived by schedules. Every one of them looked forward to that basketball game, and all of them were excited for a special event the very next morning, their own basketball tournament for the Gateway Gators, a program for adults with disabilities. They had uniforms ready, they had snacks packed, Ted's mother even ironed his jersey. They had every reason to come home that night and every reason to get a good sleep. Nothing about their plans suggested danger. Nothing pointed to a night of horror, but something happened after that game ended. Something nobody has ever been able to explain. After the game, the 5 climbed into Jack Madruga's car, a turquoise 1969 Mercury Montego. They left Chicago around 10 p.m, but instead of driving south toward home, they drove east, up a dark, winding mountain road into the remote foothills of the Plumas National Forest. This was the opposite direction of home. It was unfamiliar territory, it was freezing cold, and miles from any services. Now, none of the men were dressed for winter weather, none had camping gear, and none had any reason to actually be there. Yet, that's where the car was found, abandoned, stuck in the snow on a remote mountain track with nothing wrong with it. No damage, no mechanical issues. It had a quarter tank of gas still remaining, and it looked as if the driver simply stopped, turned off the engine, and walked into the night. But why? And where did they go? Obviously, their families were panicked when the men didn't come home. Police began searching the very next morning, and for days they came up with absolutely nothing. Then the snow melted, and the true horror of this situation began to appear. In June, 4 months after the disappearance, a forest worker discovered an abandoned cabin deep inside of the mountains. Inside of that cabin, unfortunately, was the body of Ted Weiher, and he'd starved to death, despite the cabin containing food, matches, fuel, and blankets, and also to enough supplies to service the entire winter. His feet were badly frostbitten, his body was emaciated, his beard suggested that he'd actually survived for weeks, possibly up to 12 to 13 weeks, after the initial disappearance. So why didn't he use the food? Why didn't he light a fire? Why didn't he break a window to open the locked storeroom with more supplies? Nobody knows, but it suggested one terrifying thing. Ted had not been alone. Unfortunately, nearby, the searchers found the remains of Jack Madruga, Bill Sterling, Jack Hewitt, and their bodies were scattered along a trail leading from the abandoned car towards the cabin. And strangely, they seemed to have died from exposure. It looked as if they were trying to reach help, yet the cabin with shelter and supplies sat just 19 miles away. Still missing was Gary Mathias. And strangely enough, Gary's shoes were actually found inside of the cabin. Ted was wearing Gary's shoes. This implies that Gary at some stage was there, alive, after Ted's death or possibly before it. But Gary himself was never ever found. And to this day, decades later, his fate remains completely unknown. Now, there are a lot of theories about what happened to the boys, and this is where things become very, very strange. There's a theory that they took a wrong turn. Some believe the men simply got lost, but they would never have willingly driven into the freezing mountains in the middle of the night for no reason. The second theory is that there was some sort of foul play associated with their disappearance and their deaths. Did they encounter somebody on the road? Were they chased? Were they forced up into the mountains? There's no evidence. The third theory surrounds Gary Mathias' condition. Gary struggled with psychiatric issues, but he was stable at the time. Some think that he might have led them into the mountains. But Gary had no history of wandering into danger and no past aggression towards his other four friends. The fourth theory is a panic event. Did something frighten the boys? Did it force them from the car? Did it make them flee into the woods into those freezing temperatures? The fifth theory surrounds the cabin mystery. Why didn't they use the supplies? Why didn't they break into the storeroom? Why did Ted survive for so long without using what was stored around him? The mystery only deepens. So why did five routine-loving young men take a sudden midnight drive into the Sierra Nevada? Why abandon a perfectly running car? Why walk miles into freezing darkness with no plan, no survival gear, and no clear destination? What happened in those final hours? And where is Gary Mathias? Almost 50 years later, the case remains completely unsolved. Five friends went to a basketball game and ended up at the center of one of America's strangest mysteries. If you like dark stories told at midnight, make sure you subscribe. I drop 3 new mysteries every single week. See you at midnight.